The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 8, Side 1. In the year 1060, the Seljuk Turks extended their conquests to Armenia. That harassed country has felt the claws of rival imperialisms through many centuries, because its mountains hindered its unity of defense, while its valleys provided tempting roads between Mesopotamia and the Black Sea. Greece and Persia fought for those roads as highways of trade and war. Xenophon's 10,000 traversed them. Rome and Persia fought for them. Byzantium and Persia, Byzantium and Islam, Russia and Britain. Through all vicissitudes of external pressure or domination, Armenia maintained a practical independence, a vigorous commercial and agricultural economy, a cultural autonomy that produced its own creed, literature, and art. It was the first nation to adopt Christianity as its state religion in 303. It took the Monophysite side in the debate about the nature of Christ, refusing to admit that he had shared the infirmities of human flesh. In 491, the Armenian bishops parted from Greek and Roman Christianity and formed an autonomous Armenian church under its own Catholicos. Armenian literature used the Greek language until the early 5th century, when Bishop Mesrob invented a national alphabet and translated the Bible into the Armenian tongue. Since that time, Armenia has had an abundant literature, chiefly in religion and history. From 642 to 1046, the country was nominally subject to the caliphs, but it remained virtually sovereign and zealously Christian. In the 9th century, the Bagratuni family established a dynasty under the title of Prince of Princes, built a capital at Ani, and gave the country several generations of progress and relative peace. Ashot III, from 952 to 977, was much loved by his people. He founded many churches, hospitals, convents, and almshouses, and, we are told, never sat down to meals without allowing poor men to join him. Under his son Gagik I, from 990 to 1020, how peculiar our names must seem to the Armenians, prosperity reached its height. Schools were numerous, towns were enriched by trade and adorned by art, and Kars rivaled Ani as a center of literature, theology, and philosophy. Ani had impressive palaces and a famous cathedral, circa 980, subtly compounded of Persian and Byzantine styles. Here were piers and column clusters, pointed as well as round arches, and other features that later entered into Gothic art. When, in 989, the cupola of St. Sophia in Constantinople was destroyed by an earthquake, the Byzantine emperor assigned the hazardous task of restoring it to Terdat, the architect of the Ani Cathedral. Chapter 11. The Islamic Scene, 628 to 1058. 1. The Economy. Civilization is a union of soil and soul, the resources of the earth transformed by the desire and discipline of men. Behind the facade and under the burden of courts and palaces, temples and schools, letters and luxuries and arts, stands the basic man, the hunter bringing game from the woods, the woodman felling the forest, the herdsman pasturing and breeding his flock, the peasant clearing, plowing, sowing, cultivating, reaping, tending the orchard, the vine, the hive, and the brood. The woman absorbed in the 100 crafts and cares of a functioning home, the miner digging in the earth, the builder shaping homes and vehicles and ships, the artisan fashioning products and tools, the peddler, shopkeeper, and merchant uniting and dividing maker and user, the investor fertilizing industry with his savings, the executive harnessing muscle, materials, and minds for the creation of services and goods. These are the patient yet restless leviathan on whose swaying back civilization precariously rides. All these were busy in Islam. Men raised cattle, horses, camels, goats, elephants, and dogs, stole the honey of bees and the milk of camels, goats, and cows, and grew 100 varieties of grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and flowers. The orange tree was brought from India to Arabia at some time before the 10th century. The Arabs introduced it to Syria, Asia Minor, Palestine, Egypt, and Spain, from which countries it pervaded southern Europe. The cultivation of sugar cane and the refining of sugar were likewise spread by the Arabs from India through the Near East, and were brought by crusaders to their European states. Cotton was first cultivated in Europe by the Arabs. These achievements on lands largely arid were made possible by organized irrigation. Here the caliphs made an exception to their principle of leaving the economy to free enterprise. the government directed and financed the maintenance of the greater canals. The Euphrates was channeled into Mesopotamia, the Tigris into Persia, and a great canal connected the twin rivers at Baghdad. The early Abbasid caliphs encouraged the draining of marshes and the rehabilitation of ruined villages and deserted farms. In the 10th century, under the Samanid princes, the region between Bokhara and Samarkand was considered one of the 4 earthly paradises, the others being southern Persia, southern Iraq, and the region around Damascus. Gold, silver, iron, lead, mercury, antimony, sulfur, asbestos, marble, and precious stones were mined or quarried from the earth. Divers fished for pearls in the Persian Gulf. Some use was made of naphtha and bitumen. An entry in Harun's archives gives the price of naphtha and reeds used in burning the corpse of Jafar. Industry was in the handicraft stage, practiced in homes and artisans' shops, and organized in guilds. We find few factories and no clear advance in technology except the development of the windmill. Masudi, writing in the 10th century, speaks of seeing these in Persia and the Near East. There is no sign of them in Europe before the 12th century. Possibly they were another gift of the Moslem East to its crusading foes. There was much mechanical ingenuity. The water clock sent by Harun al-Rashid to Charlemagne was made of leather and damascened brass. It told the time by metal cavaliers, who at each hour opened the door, let fall the proper number of balls on a cymbal, and then, retiring, closed the door. Production was slow, but the worker could express himself in integral work and made almost every industry an art. Persian, Syrian, and Egyptian textiles were famous for the patient perfection of their technique. Mosul for its cotton muslin, Damascus for its damask linen, Aden for its wool. Damascus was noted also for its swords of highly tempered steel, Sidon and Tyre for glass of unexcelled thinness and clarity, Baghdad for its glass and pottery, Rai for pottery, needles, combs, Raqqa for olive oil and soap, Fars for perfume and rugs. Under Moslem rule, Western Asia attained a pitch of industry and commercial prosperity unmatched by Western Europe before the 16th century. Land transport was chiefly by camels, horses, mules, and men, but the horse was too prized to be chiefly a beast of burden. "Do not call him my horse," said an Arab. "Call him my son. He runs more swiftly than the tempest, quicker than a glance. He is so light of foot that he could dance on the breast of your mistress, and she would take no hurt." So the camel, ship of the desert, bore most of the freight of Arab trade, and caravans of 4,700 camels swayed across the Moslem world. Great roads radiating from Baghdad led through Rai, Nashipur, Merv, Bokhara, and Samarkand to Kashgar and the Chinese frontier, through Basra to Shiraz, through Kufa to Medina, Mecca, and Aden, through Mosul or Damascus to the Syrian coast. Caravanserais or inns, hospices, and cisterns helped the traveler and his beasts. Much inland traffic was borne on rivers and canals. Harun al-Rashid planned a Suez Canal, but Yahya, for unknown reasons, probably financial, discouraged the idea. The Tigris at Baghdad, 750 feet wide, was spanned by 3 bridges built upon boats. Over these arteries a busy commerce passed. It was an economic advantage to Western Asia that one government united a region formerly divided among 4 states. Customs dues and other trade barriers were removed, and the flow of commodities was further eased by unity of language and faith. The Arabs did not share the European aristocrats' scorn of the merchant. Soon they joined Christians, Jews, and Persians in the business of getting goods from producer to consumer with the least possible profit to either. Cities and towns swelled and hummed with transport, barter, and sale. Peddlers cried their wares to latticed windows. Shops dangled their stock and resounded with haggling. Fairs, markets, and bazaars gathered merchandise, merchants, buyers, and poets. Caravans bound China and India to Persia, Syria, and Egypt. And ports like Baghdad, Basra, Aden, Cairo, and Alexandria sent Arab merchantmen out to sea. Muslim commerce dominated the Mediterranean till the Crusades, plying between Syria and Egypt at one end, Tunis, Sicily, Morocco, and Spain at the other, and touching Greece, Italy, and Gaul. It captured control of the Red Sea from Ethiopia. It reached over the Caspian into Mongolia and up the Volga from Astrakhan to Novgorod, Finland, Scandinavia, and Germany, where it left thousands of Moslem coins. It answered the Chinese junks that visited Basra by sending Arab dhows out from the Persian Gulf to India and Ceylon, through the straits and up the Chinese coast to Kanfu, or Canton. A colony of Muslim and Jewish merchants was well established there in the 8th century. This vitalizing commercial activity reached its peak in the 10th century when Western Europe was at nadir. And when it subsided, it left its mark upon many European languages in such words as tariff, traffic, magazine, caravan, and bazaar. The state left industry and commerce free, and it aided it with a relatively stable currency. The early caliphs used Byzantine and Persian money, but in 695, Abd al-Malik struck an Arab coinage of gold dinars and silver dirhams. Ibn Hakal, circa 975, describes a kind of promissory note for 42,000 dinars addressed to a merchant in Morocco. From the Arabic word sak, S-A-K-K, for this form of credit, is derived our word check. Investors shared in financing commercial voyages or caravans, and though interest was forbidden, ways were found, as in Europe, of evading the prohibition and repaying capital for its use and risk. Monopolies were illegal but prospered. Within a century after Omar's death, the Arab upper classes had amassed great wealth and lived on luxurious estates manned by hundreds of slaves. Yahya the Barmakid offered 7 million dirhams, or $560,000, for a pearl box made of precious stones, and was refused. The Caliph Muqtafi, if we may believe Muslim figures, left at his death 20 million dinars, or $94,500,000, in jewelry and perfumes. When Harun al-Rashid married his son al-Mamun to Durant, her grandmother emptied a shower of pearls upon the groom. And her father scattered among the guests bowls of musk, each of which contained a writ entitling the possessor to a slave, a horse, an estate, or some other gift. After Muqtadir confiscated 16 million dinars of Ibn al-Jassas's fortune, that famous jeweler remained a wealthy man. Many overseas traders were worth 4 million dinars. Hundreds of merchants had homes costing from 10,000 to 30,000 dinars, or $142,500. At the bottom of the economic structure were the slaves. They were probably more numerous in Islam in proportion to population than in Christendom, where serfdom was replacing slavery. The Caliph Muqtadir, we are told, had 11,000 eunuchs in his household. Musa took 300,000 captives in Africa, 30,000 virgins in Spain, and sold them into slavery. Qutayba captured 100,000 in Sogdiana. The figures are Oriental and must be discounted. The Quran recognized the capture of non-Muslims in war and the birth of children to slave parents as the sole legitimate sources of slavery. No Muslim, just as in Christendom no Christian, was to be enslaved. Nevertheless, a brisk trade developed in slaves captured in raids. Negroes from East and Central Africa, Turks or Chinese from Turkestan, whites from Russia, Italy, and Spain. The Muslim had full rights of life and death over his slaves. Usually, however, he handled them with a genial humanity that made their lot no worse, perhaps better, as more secure, than that of a factory worker in 19th century Europe. Slaves did most of the menial work on the farms, most of the unskilled manual work in the towns. They acted as servants in the household and as concubines or eunuchs in the harem. Most dancers, singers, and actors were slaves. The offspring of a female slave by her master, or of a free woman by her slave, was free from birth. Slaves were allowed to marry, and their children, if talented, might receive an education. It is astonishing how many sons of slaves rose to high place in the intellectual and political world of Islam. How many, like Mahmud and the early Mamelukes, became kings. Exploitation in Asiatic Islam never reached the merciless of pagan, Christian, or Moslem Egypt, where the peasant toiled every hour, earned enough to pay for a hut, a loincloth, and food this side of starvation. There was and is much begging in Islam, and much imposture in begging. But the poor Asiatic had a protective skill in working slowly. Few men could rival him in manifold adaptation to idleness. Alms were frequent, and at the worst a homeless man could sleep in the finest edifice in town, the mosque. Even so, the eternal class war simmered sullenly through the years, and broke out now and then, in 778, 796, 808, and 838, in violent revolt. Usually, since state and church were one, rebellion took a religious garb. Some sects, like the Kuramiyya and the Muhayyida, adopted the communistic ideas of the Persian rebel Mazdak. One group called itself Surk Alam, the red flag. About 772, Hashim al-Mukanna, the veiled prophet of Khorasan, announced that he was God incarnate and had come to restore the communism of Mazdak. He gathered various sects about him, defeated many armies, ruled northern Persia for 14 years, and was finally, in 786, captured and killed. In 838, Babik al-Qurani renewed the effort, gathered around him a band known as Muhamira, that is, Reds, seized Azerbaijan, held it for 22 years, defeated a succession of armies, and, Tabari would have us believe, killed 255,500 soldiers and captives before he was overcome. The Caliph Mutasim ordered Babik's own executioner to cut off Babik's limbs one by one. The trunk was impaled before the royal palace, and the head was sent on exhibition around the cities of Khorasan as a reminder that all men are born unfree and unequal. The most famous of these servile wars of the East was organized by Ali, an Arab who claimed descent from the Prophet's son-in-law. Near Basra, many Negro slaves were employed in digging saltpeter. Ali represented to them how badly they were treated, urged them to follow him in revolt, and promised them freedom, wealth, and slaves. They agreed, seized food and supplies, defeated the troops sent against them, and built themselves independent villages with palaces for their leaders, prisons for their captives, and mosques for their prayers. This in 869. The employers offered Ali 5 dinars, or $23.75 per head, if he would persuade the rebels to return to work. He refused. The surrounding country tried to starve them into submission, but when their supplies ran out, they attacked the town of Obola, freed and absorbed its slaves, sacked it, and put it to flames, this in 870. Much encouraged, Ali led his men against other towns, took many of them, captured control of southern Iran and Iraq to the gates of Baghdad. Commerce halted, and the capital began to starve. In 871, the Negro general Mohalabi, with a large army of rebels, seized Basra. If we may credit the historians, 300,000 persons were massacred, and thousands of white women and children, including the Hashemite aristocracy, became the concubines or slaves of the Negro troops. For 10 years the rebellion continued. Great armies were sent to suppress it. Amnesty and rewards were offered to deserters. Many of his men left Ali and joined the government's forces. The remnant was surrounded, besieged, and bombarded with molten lead and Greek fire, flaming torches of naphtha. Finally, a government army under the vizier Muwaffaq made its way into the rebel city, overcame resistance, killed Ali, and brought his head to the victor. Muwaffaq and his officers knelt and thanked Allah for his mercies. This in 883. The rebellion had lasted 14 years and had threatened the whole economic and political structure of Eastern Islam. Ibn Tulun, governor of Egypt, took advantage of the situation to make the richest of the caliph's provinces an independent state. 2. The faith. Next to bread and woman, in the hierarchy of desire, comes eternal salvation. When the stomach is satisfied and lust is spent, man spares a little time for God. Despite polygamy, the Muslim found considerable time for Allah and based his morals, his laws, and his government upon his religion. Theoretically, the Muslim faith was the simplest of all creeds. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. The simplicity of the formula is only apparent, for its second clause involves the acceptance of the Quran and all its teachings. Consequently, the Orthodox Muslim also believed in heaven and hell, angels and demons, the resurrection of body and soul, the divine predestination of all events, the Last Judgment, the 4 duties of Muslim practice, prayer, alms, fasting, and pilgrimage, and the divine inspiration of various prophets who led up to Muhammad. For every nation, said the Quran, there is a messenger and a prophet. Some Muslims reckon such messengers at 224,000. But apparently only Abraham, Moses, and Jesus were considered by Muhammad as having spoken the word of God. Hence, the Muslim was required to accept the Old Testament and the Gospels as inspired scriptures. Where these contradicted the Quran, it was because their divine text had been willfully or unwittingly corrupted by men. In any case, the Quran superseded all previous revelations, and Muhammad excelled all the other messengers of God. Muslims proclaimed his mere humanity, but revered him almost as intensely as Christians worshipped Christ. If I had been alive in his time, said a typical Muslim, I would not have allowed the apostle of God to put his blessed foot upon the earth, but would have borne him upon my shoulders wherever he wished to go. Making their faith still more complex, good Muslims accepted and obeyed, besides the Quran, the traditions preserved by their learned men of their prophets' customs and conversation. Time brought forward questions of creed, ritual, morals, and law to which the Holy Book gave no clear answer. Sometimes the words of the Quran were obscure and needed elucidation. It was useful to know what, on such points, the Prophet or his companions had done or said. Certain Muslims devoted themselves to gathering such traditions. During the first century of their era, they refrained from writing them down. They formed schools of hadith, or traditions, in divers cities, and gave public discourses reciting them. It was not unusual for Muslims to travel from Spain to Persia to hear a hadith from one who claimed to have it in direct succession from Muhammad. In this way, a body of oral teaching grew up alongside the Quran, as the Mishnah and Gemara grew up beside the Old Testament. And as Yehuda Hanasi gathered the oral law of the Jews into written form in 189, so in 870, al-Bukhari, after researches which led him from Egypt to Turkestan, critically examined 600,000 Mohammedan traditions and published 7,275 of them in his Sahih, correct book. Each chosen tradition was traced through a long chain, or isnad, of named transmitters to one of the companions or to the Prophet himself. Many of the traditions put a new color upon the Muslim creed. Muhammad had not claimed the power of miracles, but hundreds of pretty traditions told of his wonder-working, how he fed a multitude from food hardly adequate for one man, exorcised demons, drew rain from heaven by one prayer and stopped it by another, how he touched the udders of dry goats and they gave milk, how the sick were healed by contact with his clothes or his shorn hair. Christian influences seem to have molded many of the traditions. Love toward one's enemies was inculcated, though Muhammad had sterner views. The Lord's Prayer was adopted from the Gospels. The parables of the sower, the wedding guests, and the laborers in the vineyard were put into Muhammad's mouth. All in all, he was transformed into an excellent Christian, despite his 9 wives. Muslim critics complained that much of the hadith had been concocted as Umayyad, Abbasid, or other propaganda. Ibn Abi al-Ajah, executed at Kufa in 772, confessed to have fabricated 4,000 traditions. A few skeptics laughed at the hadith collections and composed indecent stories in solemn hadith form. Nevertheless, the acceptance of the hadith, in one or the other of the approved collections, as binding in faith and morals, became a distinguishing mark of Orthodox Muslims, who therefore received the name of Sunni, or traditionalists. One tradition represented the angel Gabriel as asking Muhammad, "What is Islam?" And Muhammad replied, "Islam is to believe in Allah and His Prophet, to recite the prescribed prayers, to give alms, to observe the fast of Ramadan, and to make the pilgrimage to Mecca." Prayer, almsgiving, fasting, and pilgrimage constituted the 4 duties of Muslim religion. These, with belief in Allah and Muhammad, are the 5 pillars of Islam. Prayer had to be preceded by purification, and as prayer was required of the Muslim 5 times a day, cleanliness came literally next to godliness. Muhammad, like Moses, used religion as a means to hygiene as well as to morality, on the general principle that the rational can secure popular acceptance only in the form of the mystical. He warned that the prayer of an unclean person would not be heard by God. He even thought of making the brushing of the teeth a prerequisite to prayer. But finally he compromised on the washing of the face, the hands, and the feet. A man who had had sexual relations, a woman who had menstruated or given birth since the last purification, must bathe before prayer. At dawn, shortly after midday, in late afternoon, at sunset, and at bedtime, the muezzin mounted a minaret to sound the adhan, or call to prayer. Allahu Akbar, God is most great. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah. I bear witness that Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. I bear witness that Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. I bear witness that Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Come to prayer, come to prayer, come to prayer. Come to success, come to success, come to success. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. There is no God but Allah. It is a powerful appeal, a noble summons to rise with the sun, a welcome interruption in the hot work of the day, a solemn message of divine majesty in the stillness of the night. Grateful even to alien ears is this strange, shrill chant of many muezzins from divers mosques, calling the earthbound soul to a moment's communion with the mysterious source of life and mind. On those 5 occasions, all Muslims everywhere must leave off whatever else they may be doing, must cleanse themselves, turn toward Mecca and the Kaaba, and recite the same brief prayers, in the same successive postures, in an impressive simultaneity, moving with the sun across the earth. Those who had the time and will would go to the mosque to say their prayers. Usually the mosque was open all day. Any Moslem, Orthodox or heretic, might enter to make his ablutions, to rest or to pray. There, too, in the cloistered shade, teachers taught their pupils, judges tried cases, caliphs announced their policies or decrees. People gathered to chat, hear the news, even to negotiate business. The mosque, like the synagogue and the church, was the center of daily life, the home and hearth of the community. Half an hour before Friday noon, the muezzin chanted from the minarets the salutation, or salam, a blessing on Allah, Muhammad, his family, and the great companions, and called the congregation to the mosque. The worshippers were expected to have bathed and put on clean clothes, and to have perfumed themselves, or they might perform minor ablutions in the tank or fountain that stood in the courtyard of the mosque. The women usually stayed at home when the men went to the mosque, and vice versa. It was feared that the presence of women, even veiled, would distract the excitable male. The worshippers removed their shoes at the door of the mosque proper, and entered in slippers or stocking feet. There, or in the court, if they were numerous, they stood shoulder to shoulder in one or more rows, facing the mihrab or prayer niche in the wall, which indicated the Qibla, or direction of Mecca. An imam or prayer leader read a passage from the Koran and preached a short sermon. Each worshipper recited several prayers, and in the prescribed postures of bowing, kneeling, and prostration. Mosque meant a place of prostration and prayer. Then the imam recited a complex series of salutations, benedictions, and orisons, in which the congregation silently joined. There were no hymns, processions, or sacraments, no collections or pew rents. Religion, being one with the state, was financed from public funds. The imam was not a priest but a layman, who continued to earn his living by a secular occupation and was appointed by the mosque warden for a specified period and a small salary to lead the congregation in prayer. There was no priesthood in Islam. After the Friday prayers, the Muslims were free, if they wished, to engage in work as on any other day. Meanwhile, however, they had known a cleansing hour of elevation above economic and social strife, and had unconsciously cemented their community by common ritual. The second duty of Muslim practice was the giving of alms. Muhammad was almost as critical of the rich as Jesus had been. Some have thought that he began as a social reformer, revolted by the contrast between the luxury of the merchant nobles and the poverty of the masses. And apparently his early followers were mostly of humble origin. One of his first activities in Medina was to establish an annual tax of 2.5% on the movable wealth of all citizens for the relief of the poor. Regular officials collected and distributed this revenue. Part of the proceeds was used to build mosques and defray the expenses of government and war. But war in return brought booty that swelled the gifts to the poor. Prayer, said Omar II, carries us halfway to God. Fasting brings us to the door of his palace. Almsgiving lets us in. The traditions abound in stories of generous Muslims. Hassan, for example, was said to have 3 times in his life divided his substance with the poor, and twice given away all that he had. The third duty was fasting. In general, the Moslem was commanded to avoid wine, carrion, blood, and the flesh of swine or dogs. But Muhammad was more lenient than Moses. Forbidden foods might be eaten in cases of necessity. Of a tasty cheese containing some prohibited meat, he only asked with his sly humor, "Mention the name of Allah over it." He frowned on asceticism and condemned monasticism. Mohammedans were to enjoy the pleasures of life with a good conscience, but in moderation. Nevertheless, Islam, like most religions, required certain fasts, partly as a discipline of the will, partly, we may presume, as hygiene. A few months after settling in Medina, he saw the Jews keeping their annual feast of Yom Kippur. He adopted it for his followers, hoping to win the Jews to Islam. When this hope faded, he transferred the fast to the month of Ramadan. For 29 days the Moslem was to abstain, during the daylight hours, from eating, drinking, smoking, or contact with the other sex. Exceptions were made for the sick, the weary traveler, the very young or old, and women with child or giving suck. When first decreed, the month of fasting fell in winter, when daylight came late and ended soon. But as the lunar calendar of the Moslems made the year shorter than the 4 seasons, Ramadan every 33 years fell in midsummer, when the days are long and the eastern heat makes thirst a torture. Yet the good Moslem bore the fast. Each night, however, the fast was broken, and the Moslem might eat, drink, smoke, and make love till the dawn. Stores and shops remained open all those nights, inviting the populace to feasting and merriment. The poor worked as usual during the month of fast. The well-to-do could ease their way through it by sleeping during the day. Very pious persons spent the last 10 nights of Ramadan in the mosque. On one of those nights, it was believed, Allah began to reveal the Quran to Muhammad. That night was accounted better than 1,000 months. And simple devotees, uncertain which of the 10 was the night of the divine decree, kept all 10 with dire solemnity. On the first day after Ramadan, the Moslems celebrated the festival of Eid al-Fitr, or breaking of the fast. They bathed, put on new clothes, saluted one another with an embrace, gave alms and presents, and visited the graves of their dead. Pilgrimage to Mecca was the 4th duty of Moslem faith. Pilgrimage to holy places was traditional in the East. The Jew lived in hopes of one day seeing Zion, and pious pagan Arabs, long before Muhammad, had trekked to the Kaaba. Muhammad accepted the old custom because he knew that ritual is less easily changed than belief, and perhaps because he himself hankered after the black stone. By yielding to the old rite, he opened a wide door to the acceptance of Islam by all Arabia. The Kaaba, purified of its idols, became for all Moslems the house of God. And upon every Mohammedan the obligation was laid, with considerate exceptions for the ailing and the poor, to make the Mecca pilgrimage as often as he can, which was soon interpreted as meaning once in a lifetime. As Islam spread to distant lands, only a minority of Moslems performed the pilgrimage. Even in Mecca there are Moslems who have never made a ritual visit to the Kaaba. Doughty has described, beyond all rivalry, the panorama of the pilgrimage caravan moving with fantastic patience across the desert, caught between the hot fury of the sun and the swirling fire of the sands. Some 7,000 believers, less or more, on foot or horse or donkey or mule or lordly palanquin, but most tossed along between the humps of camels, bowing at each long stalking pace, making 50 prostrations in every minute, whether we would or no, toward Mecca. Covering 30 miles in a weary day, sometimes 50 to reach an oasis, many pilgrims sickening and left behind, some dying and abandoned to lurking hyenas or a slower death. At Medina, the pilgrims halted to view the tombs of Muhammad, Abu Bakr, and Omar I in the Mosque of the Prophet. Near those sepulchres, says a popular tradition, a space is reserved for Jesus, the son of Miriam. Sighting Mecca, the caravan pitched its camp outside the walls, for the whole city was haram, sacred. The pilgrims bathed, dressed in seamless robes of white, and rode or walked in a line many miles long over dusty roads to seek living quarters in the town. During their stay in Mecca, they were required to abstain from all disputes, from sexual relations, and from any sinful act. In the months specially ordained for pilgrimage, the holy city became a babbling concourse of tribes and races, suddenly doffing nationality and rank in the unanimity of ritual and prayer. Into the great enclosure called the Mosque of Mecca these thousands hurried in tense anticipation of a supreme experience. They hardly noted the elegant minarets of the wall or the arcades and colonnades of the cloistered interior, but all stopped in awe at the well of Zemzem, whose water, said tradition, had slaked the thirst of Ishmael. Every pilgrim drank of it, however bitter its taste, however urgent its effects. Some bottled it to take it home, to sip its saving sanctity daily and in the hour of death. At last the worshippers, all eyes and no breath, came, near the center of the enclosure, to the Kaaba itself, a miniature temple illuminated within by silver hanging lamps, its outer wall half draped with a curtain of rich and delicate cloth, and in a corner of it the ineffable black stone. 7 times the pilgrims walked around the Kaaba and kissed or touched or bowed to the stone. Such circumambulation of a sacred object, a fire, a tree, a maypole, an altar of the temple at Jerusalem, was an old religious ritual. Many pilgrims, exhausted and yet sleepless with devotion, passed the night in the enclosure, squatting on their rugs, conversing and praying, and contemplating in wonder and ecstasy the goal of their pilgrimage. On the second day, the pilgrims, to commemorate Hagar's frantic search for water for her son, ran 7 times between the hills, Safa and Marwa, that lay outside the city. On the 7th day, those who wished to make the major pilgrimage streamed out to Mount Ararat, 6 hours' journey distant, and heard a 3-hour sermon. Returning halfway, they spent a night in prayer at the oratory of Mustalifa. On the 8th day, they rushed to the valley of Mina and threw 7 stones at 3 marks or pillars, for so they believed Abraham had cast stones at Satan when the devil interrupted his preparations for slaying his son. On the 10th day, they sacrificed a sheep, a camel, and some other horned animal, ate the meat, and distributed alms. This ceremony, commemorating similar sacrifices by Mohammed, was the central rite of the pilgrimage. And this festival of sacrifice was celebrated with like offerings to Allah by Muslims all over the world on the 10th day of the pilgrimage period. The pilgrims now shaved their heads, pared their nails, and buried the cuttings. This completed the major pilgrimage. But usually the worshipper paid another visit to the Kaaba before he returned to the caravan camp. There he resumed his profane condition and clothing, and began with proud and comforted spirit the long march back home. This famous pilgrimage served many purposes. Like that of the Jews to Jerusalem, of the Christians to Jerusalem or Rome, it intensified the worshipper's faith and bound him by a collective emotional experience to his creed and to his fellow believers. In the pilgrimage, a fusing piety brought together poor Bedouins from the desert, rich merchants from the towns, Berbers, African Negroes, Syrians, Persians, Turks, Tatars, Moslem Indians, Chinese, all wearing the same simple garb, reciting the same prayers in the same Arabic tongue. Hence, perhaps, the moderation of racial distinctions in Islam. The circling of the Kaaba seems superstitious to the non-Muslim, but the Muslim smiles at similar customs in other faiths, is disturbed by the Christian rite of eating the god, and can understand it only as an external symbol of spiritual communion and sustenance. All religions are superstitions to other faiths. And all religions, however noble in origin, soon carry an accretion of superstitions, rising naturally out of minds harassed and stupefied by the fatigue of the body and the terror of the soul in the struggle for continuance. Most Muslims believed in magic and rarely doubted the ability of sorcerers to divine the future, to reveal hidden treasures, compel affection, afflict an enemy, cure disease, or ward off the evil eye. Many believed in magic metamorphoses of men into animals or plants, or in miraculous transits through space. This is almost the framework of the Arabian Nights. Spirits were everywhere, performing every manner of trick and enchantment upon mortals, and begetting unwanted children upon careless women. Most Muslims, like half the Christian world, wore amulets as protection against evil influences, considered some days lucky, other days unlucky, and believed that dreams might reveal the future, and that God sometimes spoke to man in dreams. Everyone in Islam, as in Christendom, accepted astrology. The skies were charted not only to fix the orientation of mosques and the calendar of religious feasts, but to select a celestially propitious moment for any important enterprise, and to determine the genethliology of each individual, that is, his character and fate, as set by the position of the stars at his birth. Seeming to the outer world so indiscriminately one in ritual and belief, Islam was early divided into sects as numerous and furious as in Christendom. There were the martial, puritanic, democratic Kharijites, Murjiites, who held that no Muslim would be everlastingly damned, Jabrites, who denied free will and upheld absolute predestination, Qadarites, who defended the freedom of the will, and many others. We pay our respects to their sincerity and omniscience and pass on. But the Shiites belong inescapably to history. They overthrew the Umayyads, captured Persian, Egyptian, and Indian Islam, and deeply affected literature and philosophy. The Shia, that is, group or sect, had its origin in 2 murders, the assassination of Ali and the slaughter of Hussein and his family. A large minority of Muslims argued that since Muhammad was the chosen apostle of Allah, it must have been Allah's intent that the prophet's descendants, inheriting some measure of his divine spirit and purpose, should inherit his leadership in Islam. All caliphs except Ali seemed to them usurpers. They rejoiced when Ali became caliph, mourned when he was murdered, and were profoundly shocked by Hussein's death. Ali and Hussein became saints in Shia worship. Their shrines were held second in holiness only to the Kaaba and the Prophet's tomb. Perhaps influenced by Persian, Jewish, and Christian ideas of a Messiah, and the Buddhist conception of bodhisattvas, repeatedly incarnated saints, the Shiites considered the descendants of Ali to be imams, or exemplars, that is, infallible incarnations of divine wisdom. The eighth imam was Riza, whose tomb at Mashhad in northeastern Persia is accounted the glory of the Shia world. In 873, the 12th imam, Muhammad ibn Hassan, disappeared in the 12th year of his age. In Shia belief he did not die, but bides his time to reappear and lead the Shia Muslims to universal supremacy and bliss. As in most religions, the various sects of Islam felt toward one another an animosity more intense than that with which they viewed the infidels in their midst. To these dhimmi, Christians, Zoroastrians, Sabaeans, Jews, the Umayyad Caliphate offered a degree of toleration hardly equaled in contemporary Christian lands. They were allowed the free practice of their faiths and the retention of their churches on condition that they wear a distinctive honey-colored dress and pay a poll tax of from 1 to 4 dinars, or $4.75 to $19 per year, according to their income. This tax fell only upon non-Muslims capable of military service. It was not levied upon monks, women, adolescents, slaves, the old, crippled, blind, or very poor. In return, the dhimmi were excused or excluded from military service, were exempt from the 2.5% tax for community charity, and received the protection of the government. Their testimony was not admitted in Muslim courts, but they were allowed self-government under their own leaders, judges, and laws. The degree of toleration varied with dynasties. The successors were spasmodically severe, the Umayyads generally lenient, the Abbasids alternately lenient and severe. Omar I ejected all Jews and Christians from Arabia as Islam's holy land, and a questionable tradition ascribes to him a covenant of Omar restraining their rights in general. But this edict, if it ever existed, was in practice ignored, and Omar himself continued in Egypt the allowances formerly made to the Christian churches by the Byzantine government. The Jews of the Near East had welcomed the Arabs as liberators. They suffered now divers disabilities and occasional persecutions, but they stood on equal terms with Christians, were free once more to live and worship in Jerusalem, and prospered under Islam in Asia, Egypt, and Spain as never under Christian rule. Outside of Arabia, the Christians of Western Asia usually practiced their religion unhindered. Syria remained predominantly Christian until the 3rd Muslim century. In the reign of Ma'mun, from 813 to 833, we hear of 11,000 Christian churches in Islam, as well as hundreds of synagogues and fire temples. Christian festivals were freely and openly celebrated. Christian pilgrims came in safety to visit Christian shrines in Palestine. The Crusaders found large numbers of Christians in the Near East in the 12th century, and Christian communities have survived there to this day. Christian heretics persecuted by the patriarchs of Constantinople, Jerusalem, Alexandria, or Antioch were now free and safe under a Muslim rule that found their disputes quite unintelligible. In the 9th century, the Muslim government of Antioch appointed a special guard to keep Christian sects from massacring one another at church. Monasteries and nunneries flourished under the skeptical Umayyads. The Arabs admired the work of the monks in agriculture and reclamation, acclaimed the wines of monastic vintage, and enjoyed, in traveling, the shade and hospitality of Christian cloisters. For a time, relations between the two religions were so genial that Christians wearing crosses on their breasts conversed in mosques with Muslim friends. The Mohammedan administrative bureaucracy had hundreds of Christian employees. Christians rose so frequently to high office as to provoke Muslim complaints. Sergius, father of St. John of Damascus, was chief finance minister to Abd al-Malik, and John himself, last of the Greek fathers of the Church, headed the council that governed Damascus. The Christians of the East in general regarded Islamic rule as a lesser evil than that of the Byzantine government and Church. Despite or because of this policy of tolerance in early Islam, the new faith won over to itself in time most of the Christians, nearly all the Zoroastrians and pagans, and many of the Jews of Asia, Egypt, and North Africa. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.